is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the publisher and founder of Unwinnable. He hasn't been out in the nightlife in a long time, Stu Horvath.
Nobody has.
This is a fair point. But even before then, it wasn't happening very much.
Oh, no, it wasn't. I left that in my 20s and my 30s.
Well, how you doing today, Stu?
Pretty good. How are you?
You know, I can't complain. And tonight, we're going to talk about a book that I'd not heard of up until we chat about the episode before we started recording, Nightlife.
So Nightlife is cool because, like, I feel ahead of the curve because I actually played this back in the day.
Really?
Yeah. So it came out in 1990. That's critical information because that's before Vampire the Masquerade came out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this game feels like Vampire the Masquerade. Totally. 100%, like down to the DNA. If the date was anything other than 1990, you would say, oh, this is like the Kmart version of Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh, really?
Yes. But in this instance, the Kmart version came out first. It's very strange.
It's like the GoBots getting a jump on the Transformers by a couple of years.
Isn't that what happened?
I feel like that might have been the case as well. You know, that's a little far the way back machine. Yeah, I mean, that happened. But man, Transformers had the bigger budget. And apparently, so did Vampire the Masquerade.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's really what did it. A higher production value overall. Like, you look at the cover of Nightlife and you go, oh, it's one of those role-playing games. Like, so B tier, if that. Like, cheap art. It's like just one big kind of, like, it's a Rift style book where it's like square bound and chunky and I like a lot of the interior illustrations. I think that they've got a nice style to them, but this definitely feels like a budget production. And because of that, that kind of undercuts it. The really great game that's at the core. It's so great that I don't want to say that Vampire the Masquerade and World of Darkness lifted off of Nightlife because I don't know that. I have no evidence of that. We see this in film all the time where two movies that are like the same movie come out opposite each other. You know, spontaneous inspiration is a thing, right? And there's plenty of stuff with Ars Magica and previous games to indicate that, like, the Vampire the Masquerade World of Darkness world was kind of developing on its own in earnest since like the mid 80s. But still, there's so many like super close things about this. So in Nightlife, you play monsters. Weirdly, Hambone, there's not a lot of monster playing in role-playing games. You ever notice that?
I did notice that. You know, you mentioned something in the chat the other day asking about what are games where you really get to play the monsters, and people are scratching their heads like, no, you normally are the ones going to hunt and kill the monsters.
Yeah, like we love monsters, but we never want to be the monster. It's an interesting psychological question that I think might bear further investigation down the line. But up until this point, 1990, you don't have a whole lot of RPG history to look at. You know, the only other game where like the game is tailor-made for you to play the monsters is Monsters by Ken St. Andre. There's not a lot of nuance there. It's basically like literally turning the tables and inverting the game so that you're the monsters eating and killing the adventurers.
But are the adventurers like dicks, or are they like just normal townspeople trying to like help out, be good people?
Probably a little bit of column A, column B, a zesty mix. There's not really an interest in monsters to sort of interrogate the inner lives of monsters, right? And that's something that we really associate with Vampire the Masquerade. Those role-playing games like Werewolf and Vampire and Mage and Wraith and Mummy, there's so many. They all are sort of angst engines, right? Where like you get to play mopey, gothy to the nth degree because like you're super powered. They're not really horror games. I've never really felt that they're horror games. They're just really like, moody teenage superheroes.
But when you're a teenage goth, isn't the horror existence enough?
I mean, I guess because the horror is vulnerability and like you're not really you're an immortal vampire. Okay, yes, steaks, garlic, but really, you're not really vulnerable.
Yeah, it's true.
So in Nightlife, you play a variety of monsters, and they go by the name kin. I like the term that it's sort of a catch-all, that even though they're very different, they're all sort of united in the fact that they're not human.
I like that. That's cool.
Yeah. And it implies society, and there is a lot of society. There's a little bit of factional stuff. There's 7 different ones where you can choose from to make your characters: vampires, werewolves, Frankenstein monsters, ghosts.
Oh, you can play ghosts?
Yeah, you can play a ghost. What they call whites, and instead of a I, they use a Y to make it gothier, I guess. It is the 90s.
Or to prevent them from getting sued by WotC?
I don't think that was really an issue. I mean, there's whites in Tolkien and mythology. I mean, their vampires also have a Y in it too.
Oh, well, synergy. I got it.
Yeah, so you can play ghosts, you can play demons, which are sort of spirits that get summoned, and like there's not really a necessary association with sort of the infernal. It could be like a fairy or some sort of elemental spirit, but they all get this demon catch-all. Then you also have the Inuits. I don't know if you know this, but that's a catch-all word for certain Native American tribal groups that live in the Arctic Circle. There's nothing supernatural about Inuits.
Okay.
I don't know why they called them that in this game. It's because what they really mean is the idea of the Manitou, which is sort of like these sort of spiritual manifestations of the world and like life energy. There's a horror novel called The Manitou, which is kind of good. And that at least has like a supernatural connotation. And it's sort of Algonquin speaking peoples, which were native to the New York area, which is where this was set. So the fact that there's a type of monster called Inuit in a 90s game is kind of par for the course. Like this is the sort of like casual screw up that you get when you get a whole bunch of like nerdy white dudes making role-playing games and no one else, right? There's a lot of that. There's some really off color, like totally accidental, but like horrific racism in this book.
Well, is it accidental or is it just honestly like this was the 80s and this is in the 90s and this is kind of what we thought it was, and we didn't see that it was problematic, but man, looking back through time's hourglass, you're like, oh boy, that really was uncool.
I'll give you an example. There's a different, monster race, for lack of a better word, that is actually in concept, I think is extremely cool and creepy. They are people who dress in the greaser mode of style, so leather jackets, shades, pompadours, classic 50s rock and roll look. But instead of having eyes, they have zippers. They undo the zipper and a tentacle comes out and it sucks your life force out. Cool, right?
Yeah.
It's on that David Lynch, like creepy. Ugh. Like I could see that being the thing that happens in Twin Peaks season 4. They're called zipper heads.
Oh, God damn it.
Like, what the fuck?
Yeah. Yeah. We're going blue on this episode. There's no fucking way they could claim ignorance or like, oh, it was just the 80s. And like, I didn't think of it like that back then. Because listen, a lot of people would say that. A lot of people would be like, well, when you look at movies, you look at television, you look at how people of other races have been portrayed in cinema and in books and everything since Christ left Pittsburgh. Like, yeah, of course we're at where we're at now because people in the previous generations made a lot of shit seem okay by putting it on TV when it really wasn't okay. That is really not okay, man.
No, it's a horrible, horrible word. It's like one of the worst things that I think that you could say. But at the same time, there's nothing about that creature that is Asian coded or has any sort of like connotation that matches up with the slur, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right to a degree. I think that it was the 80s and 90s and like that word was just in the air. They saw it in a movie or something and they just got captured by like the visual and created this cool monster out of it without any concept of it being like a horrifically racist loaded term. And again, I don't think that this necessarily means they're horrible people or something. Like everybody makes mistakes. Racism is structural. People are racist all the time without realizing it. But the thing is that once you realize it, you kind of have to like address it. And that's what I'm trying to do by pointing this out. Don't mistake me. It's not cool. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, it really speaks to the larger problem of these being sort of the creations of insular groups of white middle class men. Like if they knew an Asian guy, that wouldn't have seen print or they would have come up with a different word. And like no harm, no foul. Like they saw Full Metal Jacket and they were just like, whoa, no, dude. Don't use that word.
Yeah.
And that would have been it, right?
There's so many other words.
Yeah.
like so many different ways you could have went.
Yeah. Anyway, don't be racist, folks. And diverse views is good. It makes your stuff stronger and better and more creative. So besides just the kindred thing, there's the core of the role play in Nightlife is very similar to the core sort of philosophical mechanic of Vampire the Masquerade. In Nightlife, your character is made up of a certain amount of edges, which are your powers, and which is, another.
So many things.
I know.
Keep going. Just keep going.
Yeah. This is the world that we come from. And then there's flaws. Like your edges as a vampire, it's pretty obvious. Like you're immortal. You can charm people with your hypnotism, whatever. You can change into a bat. And your flaws are like you can't go out in sunlight, or you turn into like burnt toast, and you can't eat real food, and you don't like garlic. So those are your flaws, right? And you also have a humanity score, which starts at 50, goes up if you do nice things to people, goes down if you do bad things to people, like eat them, which you have to do as a vampire.
Yeah, it's kind of a thing.
Yeah. I mean, you have to feed, and that's fine. You could as long as you don't kill people out of hand, like you're probably going to skate by with just losing a little bit of humanity, which you could offset like your carbon footprint by planting a tree or something, and making some child's life happier by giving them a stuffed animal. You'll get like that point back somehow. This is like very like 6th grade level morals. But the other thing that you use humanity for is to spend it to improve your current edges or buy new ones. So it behooves you to keep your humanity high so that you can spend it so you can get more power, so you can be cooler, right? If you go too low, you lose humanity. If you lose humanity, you become less connected to the world around you, and all of your flaws are more pronounced. They hurt you more. So like a high humanity vampire isn't bothered by garlic so much as like a low humanity vampire drives them nuts, right?
So basically what you're saying to me is that if I'm a vampire in this game and I do good things and good deeds, I can still be a vampire and enjoy pizza?
Yes.
Wow. Sign me the fuck up.
This whole matrix of things is the same as Vampire the Masquerade has humanity. If your humanity drops too low, you give in to the beast and you go feral, and like problems ensue. Like that's the key thing. That's the key thing for all World of Darkness games. Sort of have this binary. Like Mage the Ascension has, all the magic is really weird, but as soon as like somebody sees you doing magic, reality kind of reasserts itself, and you risk paradox, right? So like there's a tightrope you have to walk when casting magic. So like this basic system is already there in Nightlife, and it's just such a clear comparison. But I think that it really is just a case of them having sort of thought along the same lines. And it's really cool. Another really cool thing about Nightlife is the fact that it is very caught up in the 1990 idea of New York City, which I love because I was there.
Yeah.
And I miss it. Basically, New York City before all the subculture got sucked out of it. For some reason, all of these monsters might want to like eat people, and there's factions that want to like subjugate people and treat them like cattle. But at the same time, they really like human fashion, particularly subculture fashion, and they really like human nightclubs. So they spend all their time there. And it's kind of great. And again, this is another thing that like thematically is in Vampire the Masquerade. They're an elaborate society of lots of vampires that live in secret, but also sort of meet in our nightclubs. Like that's where our world butts up against theirs.
Right, but with a better budget like Vampire the Masquerade had, you had Lestat, whereas with Nightlife, you got Lorenzo Lamas.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing near like Tim Bradstreet's art in this book, but there is a 2-page inventory list of like fashion accessories, which Vampire the Masquerade doesn't have.
Well, that's fun.
And that is fun. And like New York City really comes alive. Like I could kind of smell the village from like circa 1992. There was like all those vendors and like incense merchants, and you could buy silver rings everywhere, and like people were hawking tapes. And I remember, every time I got off the 9th Street pass station, going to dinner, or going to like a concert or whatever, it didn't matter. Every time for a period of like 4 years in the 90s, I would run into the same bad dude Like it wasn't a subculture guy at all. It was just like receding hairline, kind of schlubby, like glasses, suede jacket, like hey, fella, young man, which direction do you know where there's a leather wholesaler? And I'd be like, what? No, I don't. Leather. Do I look like somebody who knows what, like leather wholesaling? I don't. I'm just trying to get like a hot dog at Gray's Papaya. And he'd be like, oh no, okay, I understand. And then he'd get real close. He goes, hey, do you want some weed? And it's just like, or do you want some shrooms? And it's just like what is going on here? And it was just like part of like that weird carnival atmosphere of the village, like right outside that pass station, literally like 15 minutes from my house, by a short train ride.
For those listeners who did not grow up in the tri-state area in the 80s or 90s, when it's painted a certain way in most media, TV, movies, any kind of like CBS detective show that you're watching where you're like, yeah, it's always like crazy, shady looking people selling drugs on like street corners. Like that was real. Like there were tons of people who would, you'd bump into them and be like, oh, hey, sorry, man, that's cool. And like, oh, you want to buy some weed? A little blow? And you're like, what? Like literally, if you were, and God bless them, because they hustled like no one's business. Like the drug dealers in the 80s and the 90s were doing work. If they had like pedometers back then, or you had a little tracker on your phone to see how many steps you've taken, I bet they're always taking more steps than you, and they're covering lots of ground, and they're trying to sell you some real stank weed, mostly stems. It depends on the subway station you got off of, but it was mostly stems from what I heard, allegedly. Yeah. However, I mean, New York, when they're like, we had to clean up New York, they did per se, because there was a lot of stuff that like, if a tourist got off of the subway or got out of a taxi, you would get swarmed by people in trench coats, leather jackets, mostly normally wearing like lots of more gold than they should, white after Labor Day, the whole thing. But they would be trying to sell you drugs or get you to go to Peep Show, which was the other thing. Like if they were trying to sell you drugs, like, hey, check this out, Peep Show. You're like, I'm just trying to like go see the tree, I have a child with me, sir.
I mean, I was going to Coney Island High and stuff, like looking to like, see punk rock shows. So like it wasn't like totally far. Like I want to be straight. I'm not joking. That dude, it was literally that same guy repeatedly. That's not an exaggeration. Literally the same dude was on that one corner, like would get you in the crosswalk. And it became a joke. And there's sort of a timeline there, right? Like it was the 70s, late 70s, like New York City was a living hell. The poverty was so bad, and the gangs and the crime and all, and the drugs, and like it was bad. And there was a government decision to sort of like let New York die, and New York didn't die. And through the 80s, it got better and cleaner. And I feel like by the 90s, like it was clean enough where it wasn't like outrageously dangerous anymore, like it was, circa, the Warriors. But like it still had that seediness and ghosts of it. Alphabet City was still dangerous, but the village was fine. Like you had like those rapscallions who were slinging weed, but it wasn't harder stuff than that usually.
Yeah.
And like there was a club scene. There was like, from your actual dance clubs to like punk rock clubs, like there were legitimate dedicated punk rock clubs or hardcore clubs. Like what? I miss that so bad. Like,
yeah. I mean, around the 2000s, the Mouse came in, and then there was a Starbucks in every corner.
Yeah, it was the Mouse and Giuliani. Like,
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Giuliani just like scrubbed the whole city with bleach. It was terrible with his cabaret laws and stuff.
Yeah, awful.
But like true to the name, that's the best part about this system, is that it resurrects like a whiff of that scene, that moment in time. And I feel like these guys who wrote this, they might have been daft about other stuff, but they were either, observing it or participating directly in your late 80s, early 90s punk rock scenes, goth scenes and stuff in New York City, and managed to translate it in a way that really like gives me life in a cool way.
Well, that's cool with me, my friend. Do you have any final thoughts on Nightlife?
If you see the book, pick it up. It is huge. It's like 250 pages. There's so much in it. There's like factions and all this stuff. It really is the Kmart version of Vampire the Masquerade.
I love it. And dear listener, words matter. So try to choose the right ones. And if in the past maybe you didn't, still time to do better. And with that, this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They could find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I'm posting things about, stuff like Nightlife. There's something like 5 or 6 books that came out in support of this line. One of them is about getting a band of monsters together and going on tour. This game's awesome, even if it is a little racist accidentally here and there.
We're definitely gonna have to revisit it more down the line and actually talk about the game properly. You spent most of this time talking about old New York, but hey, if you came to listen to this series for nothing but facts and figures, you're in the wrong building. You can find me on the Twitter and on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons and other RPGs. And, sometimes I leave the house and I take photos of it. So there's that. You can also check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintage RPG for a behind the scenes look at Stu's upcoming book, a behind the scenes look at my RPGs and early release episodes, a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of, and some other cool stuff. Patreon.com/vintage RPG. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, double on back to that patreon.com/vintage RPG comment that I made. There's a lot of good stuff over there. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.